Good afternoon. I'm Thalia Anagnos, a member of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute Oral History Committee. The EERI oral histories give us firsthand insights into the many changes that have occurred in earthquake engineering philosophy and practice, as well as our response to catastrophic events over time. Many of the experts that were interviewed for the EERI oral histories were in Los Angeles on the day of the San Fernando earthquake. Others from around the country rushed to Los Angeles to see the damage firsthand. Later, they devoted their efforts to trying to account for the many surprises of this earthquake, such as the realization that the faults other than the San Andreas could generate large damaging earthquakes in the LA basin. There was a lot of head scratching about the 1.25 G peak horizontal acceleration at Pacoima Dam. No one had recorded such a large acceleration previously. The near failure of the Van Norman Dam, the collapse of several freeway overpasses, and catastrophic damage to the newly opened Olive View Hospital generated a lot of buzz about deficiencies in our design practices. The earthquake community spent the next several years writing in-depth reconnaissance reports, reviewing and revising building codes, developing state and local policies, and very importantly, advocating at the state and federal level for more resources to perform research and respond to future events. The San Fernando earthquake laid the foundation for many of the programs and technological advances that we benefit from today. For example, in his oral history, Leroy Crandall talks about how TECLI, the Technical Council on Lifeline Earthquake Engineering, started as a conversation between Martin Duke and himself on an airplane ride back from a strong motion advisory committee meeting. The goal of this presentation is to give you a peek into the rich content of the oral history series. Many interviewees talk about their experiences right after the San Fernando earthquake and the initiatives that derived from that event. Because of the short time, I'll just focus on a couple and point you to where you can take a deeper dive. Stanley Scott, a research political scientist at the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley, began the oral history program in 1984 to preserve the recollections of some of those who have had pioneering careers in the field of earthquake engineering. He completed hundreds of hours of taped interviews. The first 9 volumes were published during his lifetime. The project was later taken over by the EERI Oral History Committee under the leadership of Bob Reitherman. This committee of volunteers helps EERI shape the directions of this program. Members also participate in the development of the oral histories themselves by doing background research, interviewing members of the earthquake community, and reviewing and editing drafts before they are published. To date, EERI has published 30 volumes in the oral history series called Connections. These 30 Connections volumes document interviews with 34 individuals which are available for free on the EERI website. Let's start our exploration of the Connection series with the Veterans Administration Hospital Safety Program. In his oral history, Roy Johnston praises the VA for taking immediate action in response to the devastating losses in the San Fernando earthquake. He said, "Acting responsibly in this way, the Veterans Administration probably has done more than any other department of the national government to correct deficiencies in their buildings and building programs." The San Fernando earthquake severely damaged 4 hospitals, 2 of which were operated by the VA. The VA facility at Sylmar, which opened in 1926, consisted of 45 buildings, including a 420-bed hospital and a 36-bed nursing home care unit. 26 buildings that were constructed prior to 1933 sustained the greatest damage. These were designed to the requirements of the local building code at the time, which did not require a seismic-resistant design. 4 of the buildings totally collapsed and 49 people died. In April 1971, on the recommendation of a House of Representatives subcommittee, the VA set up the Earthquake and Wind Forces Committee to study what happened and why. Here I quote from Roy Johnston's oral history to tell the story. Their task was this: the Veterans Administration should immediately identify all structures in the VA hospital system located in hazardous zones to determine what must be done to make them safe. A committee of consultants was appointed immediately, consisting of a structural engineer, seismologist, architect, fire protection engineer, and civil engineer. This committee developed new requirements for earthquake-resistant design of VA hospital facilities. Then, in 1973, Donald E. Johnson, VA Administrator, appointed the members of the old committee as the Advisory Committee on Structural Safety of Veterans Administration Facilities. The members of the committee were Bruce A. Bolt, Professor of Seismology, University of California, Berkeley; J. Armand Bergen, architectural firm of Rogers, Butler, Bergen, and Bradbury, New York, New York; Rolf H. Jensen, Consulting Fire Protection Engineers, Deerfield, Illinois; Meta A. Sozin, Professor of Civil Engineering, University of Illinois, Urbana, Illinois; and myself. We developed a whole program for the Veterans Administration. Not only a written program, but also a program of reviewing buildings in the field. We met every few months and inspected a number of VA hospitals to evaluate the magnitude of the risk. I think I visited nearly half of all the VA hospitals in the country. They were quite concerned and did not want a repeat of the San Fernando disaster. We divided the nation into risk areas based on the mapping criteria in the Uniform Building Code. All the Zone 3 and Zone 2 areas, considered to be the most vulnerable priorities, were established, and the hospitals at greatest risk were reviewed first. The zone areas were later changed to include a Zone 4. In 1971, there were no known precedents for a nationwide program for evaluating and strengthening existing buildings to resist seismic forces. Developing a program of this magnitude was groundbreaking. The committee is still operational today. Roy Johnston continues with his description of the operation of the program. We set up a program, and engineers throughout the country were hired to review the hospitals and propose retrofit schemes. The Oversight Committee really jogged the VA into doing the job correctly. They made every effort to do the job in a professional way. They hired good people and made them toe the mark with respect to designs. They had a system of review, much like the Office of the State Architect in California had for public schools, and they insisted that the structures meet certain seismic standards. We not only set up the criteria for design, but also the procedures for prioritizing the work. Then we made site visits to monitor what was done, with open meetings subject to review and questioning. We would meet as a body, and the VA engineers were free to ask questions and make their input. It was a learning experience for them. The VA staff could ask us any questions, and we could call in staff and ask them questions. It was an oversight committee that actually worked. It was not just a paper-pushing or pro forma operation. The committee actually functioned and served, and did a really worthy job. The director of the VA gave us total cooperation, and I think the program elevated substantially the level of earthquake engineering within the Veterans Administration. The Advisory Committee on Structural Safety of VA Facilities formally approved the original VA seismic design document, H08-8, Earthquake-Resistant Design Requirements for VA Facilities, in 1975. These requirements were developed with the concept that all VA essential facilities must remain in operation after an earthquake, and were far in advance of the national codes. Considering post-earthquake functionality rather than just life safety was a significant change in the design approach. Here are a few highlights of the advancements that were included in this design document. Newly developed methods of identifying and characterizing seismic risks that considered local geologic conditions and the frequency of earthquake occurrence. Newly developed procedures for evaluating existing VA facilities for seismic resistance. Development of a retrofit program that considered not only the strength of the structure, but also the level of ground shaking expected during the life of the structure. And finally, guidance to ensure uninterrupted function of hospital facilities rather than designing to a level that safeguards life and prevents collapse. A major revision to the code was made in 1995 to bring VA seismic design requirements more in line with updated national codes. At that time, the document was given a revised title of H18-8, Seismic Design Requirements. Roy Johnston felt that the VA hospital safety program was a big success. This is what he said. First, they proposed a code for all new buildings, which was tailor-made to their buildings. Second, they reviewed all of their hospital buildings and put them in a prioritized list. Then they started to retrofit those hospitals. They did this in spite of the politics, and in this case, they had good people in charge. The committee acted in a responsible way and kept the people in the VA on track. I think they did a remarkable job. The fact that their own facilities in San Fernando suffered that direct hit, with many deaths, no doubt made them very sensitive to the problem of seismic performance. That earthquake was the trigger, no question about it. I believe a key factor was the people in the VA. They were influenced by the committee and were dedicated to preventing another catastrophe. One last word about hospitals. The significant damage to hospitals in the earthquake placed a spotlight on seismic design and construction of hospitals. The Hospital Facilities Seismic Safety Act was passed in 1972. In his oral history, Jack Meehan gives us some insight into how the guidelines were developed so quickly. Seems like there was a bit of serendipity involved. Here is what he said. One of my assignments from Carl Steinbrugge was to work on a hospital bill to draft legislation for hospital construction based on the Field Act. I was asked to use Field Act concepts and controls adapted as I saw fit. When I finally got around to doing this, believe it or not, I had taken a copy of the Field Act home the weekend before the San Fernando earthquake and marked it up and added a few other important things. I adapted the Field Act philosophy to hospital construction and placed enforcement in the Department of General Services, just like the Field Act. I also put in the requirement that a structural engineer must do the structural design. Charlie DeMaria and I became a committee to prepare the bill. We, together with Gordon Oakschott, added requirements for a geologic study of the sites and a review of those site reports by the Division of Mines and Geology and a plan review by the State Fire Marshal. He proceeds to talk about how he took pictures of the Olive View Hospital and showed them to Senator Alquist. Alquist then introduced the bill in 1971, and it was killed due to opposition from the Hospital Association. Senator Alquist reintroduced the bill in 1972, and it passed. Let's move to George Hausner. He provides a wonderful history of the development of strong motion instruments and the efforts to establish a nationally supported strong motion instrumentation program. The first U.S. accelerographs were installed in Southern California by the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey in the summer of 1932. The timing was quite fortuitous because the Coast and Geodetic Survey was able to capture records from the March 10, 1933 Long Beach earthquake. According to Hausner in his oral history, this was a milestone, as it was the first time any such records had been made anywhere in the world. After the Long Beach earthquake, the network was expanded to 50 instruments, some of which were located in the upper stories of buildings in Los Angeles and San Francisco. Franklin Ulrich was chief of the Seismic Field Survey and was responsible for optimizing the siting of the instruments. In his oral history, Hausner states, Ulrich took the job very seriously. I remember that he came by twice each year to talk to Professor Martel, and Martel would have me sit with them. Ulrich would explain his plans, what he was going to do with the instruments. Of course, he only had a small number. He would say, well, I'm planning to take the instrument from here and put it there. What do you think of that? They would discuss the optimum location for the small number of instruments he had available. The program did prove very astute in locating accelerographs, having an instrument in the area of strong shaking and thus making records of the 1933 Long Beach earthquake, the 1940 El Centro earthquakes, the 1949 earthquake in Olympia, Washington, and the 1952 Tehachapi earthquake. Although engineers had been advocating for some time about the need to instrument buildings to better understand their behavior, the 1964 Alaska earthquake provided the stimulus to mandate strong motion instrumentation in tall buildings. The city of Los Angeles adopted a code change on February 14, 1965, requiring new buildings 10 stories or higher to include 3 accelerographs, one in the basement, one on the roof, and one at mid-height. George Hausner shares the following recollection. John Monning, head of the Los Angeles Building Department and a Caltech graduate, probably was the one who saw the significance of the high-rise damage observed in Anchorage. I infer that Monning saw what happened in Anchorage and thought, well, if the buildings in Los Angeles that are over 5 stories high were non-functional at the end of the earthquake, it would be a catastrophe. Monning also saw the importance of recording the movements of buildings to get an idea of kinds of shaking in which various kinds of buildings might or might not be damaged. Anyway, the department decided that something had to be done. Monning proposed an instrumentation requirement to the city council. Several times he asked me to go over and talk to them and explain why it was so important to do that kind of instrumentation. Finally, they did agree, so Manning got the building instrumentation provision put in the Los Angeles Code. According to George Hausner, some structural engineers were opposed to the idea. He says, "They opposed the proposal at one hearing that I attended, where one of the engineers spoke against it, saying he represented the Structural Engineers Association of Southern California. As best I can make out, some engineers had an uneasy feeling that by putting in the instruments, we would be spying on the engineer's handiwork. Their position was not strong, however, and the measure to install instruments was approved by the City Council." By 1971, at the time of the San Fernando earthquake, there were more than 250 strong-motion seismographs installed in Southern California. The earthquake occurred virtually at the center of the Southern California strong-motion earthquake instrumentation network and provided an unprecedented number of records that was used to characterize the ground motion and help scientists and engineers understand how structures responded to the ground motion. Hausner talks about the impact these records had on seismic design requirements in Los Angeles. He says, "By 1971, something like 60 buildings were instrumented. We got about 200 records. That is, 200 accelerograph records of ground or building motions. We got more records in that 1971 earthquake than had been obtained in the entire world before that. Moreover, all the instruments operated properly, which prompted the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey to give Richard Maley a citation for his excellent performance in maintaining the instruments. The information obtained sort of laid to rest some of the engineers' questions about what buildings do in earthquakes. The 1971 records demonstrated that the seismic motion and forces in buildings are actually much larger than those prescribed in the building code. This finding led to changes in the code. For one thing, in May 1975, Los Angeles added a requirement for dynamic analysis when designing buildings over 16 stories. Finally, I would like to reiterate that the San Fernando earthquake served as a catalyst for local, state, and national programs and policies that have resulted in significant reduction in seismic risk. The Alquist-Priolo Fault Zoning Act, the Hospital Facilities Seismic Safety Act, the Earthquake Hazard Reduction Act that gave birth to NEHRP, and the California Strong Motion Instrumentation Program are just a few. As mentioned in so many of the oral histories, having champions in government was key to passing many of these laws immediately after the earthquake. When Leroy Crandall discusses passing the law to create SMIP in his oral history, he mentions the important contributions of California State Senator Alfred Alquist. He says, "I also think Senator Alfred Alquist was probably the most supportive and instrumental California state legislator in this, and he realized the importance of coming up with legislation that created a program of instrumentation." In his oral history, George Mader said the following, "Those in the field of hazards often say that there is a window of opportunity immediately following a disaster to pass legislation and make substantial regulatory changes, and that you need a champion. We had our disaster in the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, and our champion in Senator Alquist, and substantial new state legislation was adopted." The 1971 San Fernando earthquake was a pivotal event in the development of knowledge about earthquakes and the responsive structures to seismic loads. The devastation of this earthquake spawned many initiatives and accelerated others, aimed at being more intentional and systematic about how we collect and analyze the data produced from earthquakes. And importantly, in the aftermath of this event, the community formed initiatives, partnerships, and organizations to create mechanisms to ensure that what we learned was adopted into practice. Here are a few examples of initiatives that are discussed in the EERI Oral History Series. William Anderson and Robert Wallace discussed the many years of advocacy and debate that led to the passage of the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Act and the creation of the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program. Roland Sharp provides insights into SEOC's creation of the nonprofit Applied Technology Council to speed the transfer of research into practice. And George Mader and Roy Johnston both discussed the Governor's Earthquake Council and the subsequent creation of the California Seismic Safety Commission. In the next few months, we expect to publish the oral history of Bob Olson, the first executive director of the California Seismic Safety Commission. Visit eeri.org for more information.